Welcome to the March 2019 Migrating to Azure webinar for Synnex Australia. In today's webinar, we'll be covering off 4 key areas: migration triggers, Azure Migrate, Azure Site Recovery, and the licensing benefits that can be achieved by customers when they do move into Azure. So while there are quite a variety of different migration drivers that customers may be thinking of when it comes time to start migrating workloads to Azure, there are a couple of key ones that are going on right now. So some of these include the end of support for certain Microsoft services and products such as Windows Server 2008 and R2 and SQL Server 2008 and R2. But in the world that we live in at the moment, there are other reasons that organizations should be looking at moving their infrastructure forward. And this includes some of the additional compliance requirements that are starting to burden some organizations, as well as making sure that they're staying on top of the security threats that are taking place in the environment that we all operate inside of today. As we start looking at some of the different cloud migration strategies that are available, we won't be going through all of these different options here. Instead, we'll be focusing on what we've got over on the left-hand side, which is really a big focus on rehosting, also known as lift and shift, which is what we've commonly been calling it. And what we really want to do here is take the opportunity to move existing workloads and try to get them into the cloud quite quickly, so that we can really start moving people off of older hardware platforms and onto newer platforms in terms of hardware and software in cloud environments. And what this means is that it can start to reduce some of the capital expenditure that the customers have previously experienced. We can start freeing up space internally if needed, and we can really get a very, very quick return on investment in these scenarios. So really, when we're talking about the Azure technologies here, we're most heavily focused on the IaaS side. Once we start looking at what's happening with Windows Server 2008 and R2 and SQL Server 2008 and R2, well, with Windows Server, we've got under a year left now, so that expires or reaches end of support in January 14, 2020, whereas SQL Server 2008 and R2, they reach end of support in July 2019. Now, if the organizations are moving their workloads based on these into Microsoft Azure, they'll actually get an additional 3 years of security updates after these support dates. So if you do have customers that are waiting on a particular update from a line of business application vendor, or if they're waiting for final approval of budget to actually do a much larger scale migration, this might be something that allows you just to get that little bit of extra time that might be needed to make sure that the workload can be migrated. Now, areas where you have to be careful with this kind of conversation is just ensuring that customers do realize that this is a fixed 3-year period, and that once that 3 years is up, they'll really be expected to have moved on to something else by then. So let's jump in now and talk about the first of the scenarios, which is using Azure Migrate to start assessing the customer environment. Now, what's important to note when we do start talking about assessing Azure environments for migration is that Azure Migrate is just one of several different tools that are available. Now, Azure Migrate is Microsoft's tool, so obviously it's part of the Azure service. It's something that's available free of use for customers to start planning their initial migrations. And it's step one in what we think of as what that final migration process should look like. So there's the initial assessment, there's moving into the migration stage, then there's the ongoing optimization, and then finally making sure that we've got the appropriate security and management in place and that we can continue to leverage additional security and management capabilities that get rolled into the platform. So as I mentioned, there are a variety of tools available from third parties. So if you do look at Azure Migrate and you find that it doesn't quite meet all of your requirements, there are a variety of third parties out there. Some of these might be names you're already familiar with. So in this case, what we will do though is focus on the assess stage. So we'll take a look at Azure Migrate and then we'll work through some of the additional steps that are required. Once we start working with Azure Migrate, we start not just looking at things such as the size of the VM in terms of how much memory, how much storage, and how many CPUs have been allocated, but we start looking at things like the performance history of the virtual machines themselves. So what this means is that we can really start getting way more accurate in terms of trying to predict what size of Azure virtual machine is going to make more sense for the workloads we're migrating across. Now we can also start plugging in details such as, do we want to leverage some of the licensing benefits? So do we want to start using things like reserved instance, for example? Do we have the ability to use Azure hybrid benefit? Now these are things that we haven't discussed yet, but we will cover these off at the end of the session if you aren't familiar with them. And then we can also target, where we actually want these workloads to end up. Now, things that Azure Migrate will perform for us, it will do a suitability analysis, so it will make sure that what we're trying to migrate is something that it knows should be a workload that should be able to move across to Azure quite easily. It will make sure that we're picking the right size VMs, because going through and just sort of over provisioning VM capacity or storage or compute capacity in Azure isn't really going to be very cost beneficial to the customer. So we can get some cost estimates, and we can also use the Azure Migrate service to start building out an app dependency map. So it starts to give us a bit of insight into the different virtual machines and their dependencies on each other. So for example, it might be a multi-tier application where there's a database and a web front end, for example. It will make sure that these types of relationships can easily be identified so that you can take them into account as part of the migration service. Now, things that are becoming available in Azure Migrate as we move forward will be things such as the Hyper-V assessment is in public preview right now. It assesses Windows environments and Linux environments, and as I mentioned, it's a free built-in service, so it's something that you can effectively jump straight into the Azure portal and taking a look at. So, as I mentioned, the scenario that we're going to be looking at in today's session is really heavily focused on the infrastructure as a service model. So we'll be very heavily focused on Azure virtual machines, and we'll be looking at how we go about the process of rehosting those virtual machines and moving them into Azure. Now, when we talk about Azure Migrate, one of the important things to note is that Azure Migrate itself is really just the assessment service. So over time, you will see ongoing integration with Azure Site Recovery to perform this migration. But right now, it really is a two-step process where we're doing the on-prem assessment and then we're configuring Azure Site Recovery to perform those migrations based on the information that we're receiving. But we'll talk a little bit more about Azure Site Recovery in the next module. Some of the things that have changed with Azure Site Recovery with recent updates, so it's continuing to enhance the support for Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2. So making sure that you'll have support for both the 32-bit edition of 2008 and 2008, the 32-bit version of 2008, as well as the 64-bit, to make sure that if people really do have some legacy 32-bit application dependency, that's something that they can also move forward with. Now, there's also extended support for different Linux distributions, and I'm just calling this one out now because it's important to note that this is not just about Windows migrations. This is about doing migrations for Linux distributions that are running on-prem as well. Now, some of the preview features, so I've kind of touched upon some of these already, but really what Microsoft is trying to do with Azure Migrate is make it a tool that not just integrates with other Microsoft tools over time, but works with different ISV tools as well. So you can basically plug in the different assessment or migration solution that's going to perform best for you. Now, some of the things that are in preview right now are Hyper-V assessments. So the version that's currently shipping, that's available directly in Azure, it does support VMware environments, but moving forward we'll have Hyper-V assessment capabilities. There'll be enhancements for the VMware capabilities that are in there, as well as moving towards an agentless migration approach rather than having to get an agent down onto the virtual machines to allow this migration to occur. We can also start using migration tools to start interrogating or inspecting what we've got on-prem in terms of databases. So you'll see over on the left-hand side, we've got things like MongoDB, MySQL, and PostgreSQL in there as well, alongside the traditional SQL Server installations that a customer may have. And what we can do with the Azure Database Migration Service is we can go through, we can do the assessment, and then we can use that database migration service to make recommendations and provide guidance as to what's the best thing we should be moving that workload across to over on the Azure side. Because in a lot of cases, there might be some new Azure database options that are available that you may not be aware of. So as we start digging further into the Azure Migrate service, what we're doing when we're running this is, first of all, we need to discover the machines that are in there. And part of this process is that we're effectively downloading a virtual appliance and having that start to collect the information inside of our organization so that it can feed that information through to the Azure Migrate service. So we start off by creating an Azure Migrate project. So we do this in the Azure portal. Each project can support up to 1,500 virtual machines. So if you do have a larger customer with more virtual machines than that, just create multiple projects and you can go through and keep expanding that way. When it's time to create that collector, as I mentioned, this is a virtual appliance, so it's a virtual machine in the OVA format that we download. We bring it into our on-prem VMware environment. We create that collector and then we let the appliance run so that it can start doing the discovery project of that project. Now that information that it discovers is pushed through to your Azure Migrate project, and each of those is identified with its own project ID key to make sure that what you're transferring is only coming in from your environments. Once information starts to show up in the Azure Migrate blade in the Azure portal, what you'll start seeing there will be different stages of readiness for the different VMs that are discovered. So there are ones that will show up as green, and these are the ones that are ready for Azure. There are ones where it's saying that it's ready, but there are probably some things you need to be aware of. And then there will be other ones where it's identifying that there could potentially be issues based on something that it's seeing. And then finally, there's the readiness unknown. So for some reason, it hasn't been able to interrogate that. Now, what we can also do is, rather than just sort of relying on some baseline information that the hypervisor is providing, we can also install an agent onto those virtual machines to really start getting much deeper understanding of the performance requirements of those workloads. So that ties into what we're seeing here is that we can use that performance-based that performance information to really start getting a good idea of how big the VMs need to be, not just in terms of CPU and memory, but also what are the storage requirements. So things such as what are the IOPS requirements, etc., that may be needed to keep this workload running in a manner that's going to be acceptable to the customer. And what it does is it allows for that over allocation of on-prem workload. So in a lot of cases, virtual machines might have too much memory allocated, or they might have too many CPU cores allocated. And in an on-prem environment where the hypervisor might be sharing or rebalancing some of those resources as needed, that's not really a model that works in a public cloud environment. So being able to accurately predict the size of the virtual machines is something that goes a long way to getting strong cost optimization for the customer. So the storage will try to map out the different attached disks. It will make sure that you've got the appropriate number of network adapters in the size of the VM, as well as the obvious things such as CPU and memory requirements. Based on what it discovers, it will go through and provide estimates. So it goes through, it queries the Azure billing API, so it can go through and give you an all-up cost of what things are going to cost per month. Now, you can go through and start making adjustments to what the recommendations are. So if you decide that you want a different family of Azure VMs, or you want different sizes of Azure VMs, these are quick and easy ways for you to go through and start seeing that just some small changes to VM sizes can have quite a big impact in terms of the cost savings available to customers. So some of the other customizations we can make with that assessment, so where do we want to actually migrate the workload to? So at the time of this recording, Azure Migrate currently supports 30 regions, with more of the regions coming online. The pricing tier is effectively going to default across to standard, which is what you want for the VMs. For storage types, the default value is premium managed disks. Now, generally speaking, you want to stick with managed disks, and there may be cases where you do need premium disks, but there might be a lot of cases where premium disks, the additional price involved with those may not necessarily be required for all of the workloads that you're migrating. And then finally, with the comfort factor, what this does is it effectively gives us just a bit of breathing space within the VMs that it's interrogating or assessing, so that if it's something where we're going, look, we think we've accounted for things like peak workloads throughout the year, etc., but maybe we just want to give a little bit of extra space, like a bit of extra capacity just in case. And that's what we get with the comfort factor. Now, as we move into Azure Site Recovery, some of the supported scenarios all up, we've got with and without Virtual Machine Manager when we're working with Hyper-V. We've got VMware replication capabilities as well as physical machine replication. Now, all we'll be focusing on in today's recording is doing that Hyper-V virtual machine replication across to Azure, and that's without using Virtual Machine Manager. So someone who's just enabled Hyper-V on a Windows server, for example. So some of the things that we get when we work with Azure Site Recovery. So we don't have to worry about having our own sites. We don't have to worry, our own disaster recovery sites. We don't have to worry about having the appropriate hardware. Instead, what we're doing is just using Azure as that secondary site during those outages. And we can have it so that we can automatically replicate over to Azure, so that if we do need to have planned failover or an unplanned failover and then to fail back, these are the types of things that we can do. It's got support for complex workloads, including some that are very, very database heavy, like what you're seeing listed here. And it means that we can basically start, moving workloads across to the cloud as needed, rather than just using it as the site recovery option. So in order to get this working, we need to make sure that we've got the appropriate permissions in the Azure tenant to start configuring this. We need to set up a storage account so that we've got a location for the virtual machine storage to go to. And we also need to have the appropriate virtual networks set up so that we can start failing over into a production failover environment or into a test failover environment. But we can talk a bit more about these as we start going through. There's also the ASR deployment planning spreadsheet, and this spreadsheet gives you an idea of what expectations you should have in terms of bandwidth requirements, the time it takes for you to start being able to migrate the virtual machines that you've got. So you start providing things such as the number of virtual machines, the amount of storage, the estimate of what % disk churn you've got, just so that it can get an idea of just how much data it needs to start replicating out. What this will normally indicate to a lot of organizations that don't have great outbound bandwidth is that they're probably going to have to start breaking these migration projects up into smaller chunks of particular workloads to make sure that they can do that migration in a timely manner. When it comes time to configure the infrastructure, just making sure you've got the appropriate supported version of Hyper-V. So because the technology that or the scenario we're working through here is the Hyper-V based scenario, we need to make sure that we're running it on top of Windows Server 2012 R2 or later, because that's where the Hyper-V replica capability started to come through. Now we need to verify the Hyper-V host and storage requirements, so making sure that we're not doing anything unusual with disks. So if you're using, generally speaking, if you're using like VHD or VHDX, it doesn't matter if it's Gen 1 or Gen 2 VMs, but it calls out a couple of disk issues here that you need to be aware of, such as if you've got encrypted disks, that's not something that the tool will migrate for you. And also if you're doing things like doing direct attached storage to the VM as opposed to attaching a VHD or VHDX file. Making sure you've got internet access is also important, and then ensuring that if you do fail over, that you've got the appropriate way of connecting into those remote VMs to make sure that you can actually test that things are up and running as you expect. For the process, we need to go through and start setting up a few elements, such as setting up the protection goal. In this case, the protection goal is going to be migrating Hyper-V machines to Azure. And as we work through the Azure portal, you get to see the different options, such as are we replicating from Azure to Azure, or Azure to, from on-prem to Azure, or on-prem to on-prem. In this case, we're going from on-prem to Azure. So we need to create a Hyper-V site, so basically the location where that Hyper-V server is, and then we can start adding the hosts from that environment. And what we need to do is install the site recovery provider onto those hosts and register them, and effectively that will start showing the virtual machines that are installed on those hosts up in the Azure portal, so that we can start determining what we want to do with them. We need to choose the target subscription and the target resource groups. So generally speaking, you want to have things like the networking, the storage, and the resource group details all planned out in advance, and potentially even created in Azure in advance, so that you're just picking from pre-created options as you're doing the migration, to try to make sure that just to try to eliminate any risk of someone accidentally choosing something or creating something new that they shouldn't be doing there. So we go through, we create the recovery services vault. So this is a pretty easy process. So as I mentioned, in the example that you're seeing here, for resource group, you'll see that they're actually using the existing resource group. So effectively in this case, they've gone through and said, let's get some of these Azure requirements or prereqs configured appropriately so that when it's time to start picking workloads to migrate, it's a pretty easy process of just choosing the appropriate options from the drop-downs. Once it's time to enable replication, then we can go through, we go through, we select the subscription, the storage account, and the network information. So again, if these have all been pre-created, it means that it's a much easier option and much less prone to error. When it's time to do the virtual machine replication, this is where we get a chance to see, is it actually, do we have the appropriate virtual machine size that we needed? Is it replicating everything that we really need? And then this way we can also start doing things such as excluding disks that may not actually have any appropriate data that we want to replicate. So if it's just a drive that's got your temporary disk, for example, where your page file might be, that's not really something that you need to keep replicating on at 5 or 15-minute intervals. Now, for the replication policy, one of the things that's important to note here is that like previously, options of copy frequency of 5 minutes or 15 minutes were available, but now effectively that has come down to just being that 5-minute option, because the idea here is that we want to keep very, very tight consistency. It also starts to highlight that if somebody is thinking about this, who doesn't have appropriate bandwidth, that starts to think that that increased frequency might be problematic, it's really worth sort of talking to you as their partner about what you can do to get their network into shape or their internet connection into shape to support this kind of workload. Now we can go through and we can target the initial replication to start immediately. So if you are doing this after hours, that makes sense. But if you're getting this configured during work hours, you probably want to go through and set up a time that you want that replication to occur, sometime after the organization really winds down for the day. For the recovery plan, we can go through, we can group virtual machines and then have different behaviors on those groups. So things like delaying the startup times, deploying groups that have got particular relationships on each other. And we can also have additional scripts that run on those virtual machines. So any additional configurations we need to perform can be run as we start doing this failover process. When we look at the planned and unplanned failover options, the terminology here is when we talk about a planned failover, this is where we're failing over because we've got an upcoming data center scenario that we need to plan for. So we know that there might be power changes coming in the area where we need to sort of shut everything down. So it's a way of making sure we can do a graceful failover into the Azure environment that we've configured. Now, when we talk about unplanned failovers, this is where we've got the situation where something happens, it could be flooding, fire, other natural disasters. It could just be power goes out for no reason and you've got no ETA on when things will be back. This way you could do a failover to Azure, but you're starting up in Azure knowing that there is going to be some data loss because there'll be things that didn't get a chance to replicate before power went offline. Now, it's also important to note here is that with these failovers is that these are things that you will need to trigger. So you could script something that happens automatically if you really want to, but it's not something where the service itself is monitoring for heartbeats or anything like that. This isn't a high availability solution. It's not something that instantly kicks in the second or millisecond it can't detect something else. It's something where there is going to be a degree of human interaction to make sure that it does move forward as planned. So some of the test failover best practices, just to get you started here, is making sure that that when you are testing things out, that making sure that you're doing this to a test network rather than to a production network that might be connected via a VNet. So that way you can test workloads out without them impacting other VMs that are running on-prem. Creating those failover groups that we mentioned, and then thinking about what needs to be done. And these are things you'll discover when you're doing test failovers. So what are the things you need to do with those recovery plans, with Azure automation that will help to make sure that those VMs are in really good shape to get up and running in this new environment. And also you need to think about, ensuring that, other machines on other networks that expect to be able to connect to these can do so. When it comes time to fail back to on-prem, so let's say that we're actually just doing some testing and we're not quite ready to do a full migration, we can do failback if needed. So we've got two options when it's time to fail back. We can do the full download, which basically means we need to shut the VMs down so that we can effectively just transfer what's sitting there static in storage. However, if we need to keep the workloads up and running for, let's say your ordering website or something like that, then we can choose the option to minimize downtime. So the VMs keep running, but obviously there's going to be more data that keeps having to get trickled back. So that one is going to take a little bit longer, but then eventually it will get to the point where it will need to do a shutdown so that it can transfer over to the new environment. So once we get those workloads migrated, additional things we should really be thinking about here is, as we jump into that final stage of securing and managing those workloads, taking a look at the additional services that are provided as part of Azure. So things like Azure Security Center, Azure Monitor. There's there's a lot of different things that we can start getting out of Azure once we've got those workloads migrated. And a lot of this is really just incremental things where we can look at what's being offered. Is it something that's of value to the customer, and then enabling those services for them. Now, finally, we'll get into the licensing benefits in Azure. So what are some of the things that a customer might be doing today that could assist with Azure, especially in terms of pricing, but also what are some of the things that they should be thinking about when it's time to move to Azure, or that you should be having conversations with them about. So the first one is if the customer doesn't have software assurance on existing Windows Server or SQL Server installs, that you can license Windows Server and SQL Server via CSP. Alternatively, you could just use the licensing that's available through the Azure VMs. So when you're choosing an Azure VM with Windows Server or SQL Server, we can just leveraging the licenses for the software that's included. Now, what we can also do is we can start looking at Azure reserved instances. And this is where we can reserve virtual machines for a 1 year or a 3 year term, and we get up to a 72% saving over pay-as-you-go models. So this means that we can really start getting much better value for money. And even when we think about that 72% saving, we don't have to sort of keep the same virtual machines running. We're effectively like reserving a number of CPU cores so that we can say, look, this is how many cores approximately we think we need. So you can sort of mix and match things within that same product family, within the same region, so that you can keep adjusting things as needed. And even when you look at it in terms of, if you think, what if you need to sort of scale back a little bit over time, when you start thinking about that 72% saving, you end up in such a better position that it makes that whole conversation a lot easier for you. Now, there is going to be, if someone does change their mind and decide that they don't want to have the reserved instances anymore, there is a 12% penalty as part of the clause to move out of that license agreement. But even in that case, it's not a major penalty. So if someone does need to make major changes over time, it's not something that is really going to leave them with a large financial burden. Now, if the customer does have software assurance on existing existing server or SQL installations, they can start using the hybrid use benefit. And this can be combined with reserved instances to give up to a 93% saving. Now, you'll see here that for Windows Server and SQL Server, there are some different ways that we go through and start doing the calculations of what they can use and how much they can save. So what I'd suggest with this is that if you do have questions about this, and because obviously if you're not a licensing person, the complexities of licensing can jump in pretty quickly, please chat to your Synnex rep, and they can go through and give you the best options for really making sure that your customer's getting the best value for money. So if we take a look at this scenario, this gives a breakdown for a particular scenario where a customer paying full rates for the hardware and full rates for the licensing. By the time we move across to the Azure Hybrid benefit for Server and SQL Server with 3-year reserved instances, this is where you can see that the price drop has gone from $3.97 per hour down to 28 cents per hour. So obviously this is quite an extreme example, but it does give you an idea of some of these different benefits that the customer can leverage that can really save them a lot of money. So just a few important things to note is that we do have ongoing training available. So you can download the PDF of this webinar so that you can take a look at when the Tech Day series are, when the webinars are, because we'll be running events in Sydney and Melbourne through to June of this year. But also note that there are a variety of different programs and incentives in place at the moment through the CSP channel. So we've got some here for basically adding new customers for Microsoft 365 incentives as well. But obviously there are also going to be ones around Azure and things like SQL Server and Windows Server. So it's really a good opportunity for you to be out there like looking at some of these different scenarios, looking at how you can do it and take advantage of some of these offers that are in place in the market right now. Now to wrap up, the final slide for today's presentation is really just to promote the Rugby World Cup promotion that Synnex is running at the moment. So in this case, there'll be five Synnex Microsoft CSP partners will get a chance to basically they'll win that trip of a lifetime. So going to Japan for the Rugby World Cup towards the end of this year. So again, if you've got questions about this, speak to your Synnex rep and they can give you the full terms and conditions to make sure that you're doing what's needed to put you in with a good chance to win. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar, and please go and take a look at the link that you should be receiving with this to download the presentation so you can look at the appropriate URLs.